Tonight, we have the honor of having with us Biddle. Biddle is philosopher and editor of Objective Standard, a quarterly journal for culture and politics. His writing and lecturing on philosophical and political issues are from an objective perspective. Objectivism being the philosophy created by Ayn Rand. His first book, Love Life, Morality of Self-Interest and the Facts that Support It, is a highly concretized, systematic introduction to Ayn Rand's ethics. His book in progress, which is tentatively titled Thinking in Principles, The Science of Selfishness, is about how to use one's mind in the service of one's life, liberty, and happiness. He has lectured and taught seminars at different universities across the U.S., including Stanford, Tufts, UVA, UCLA, UW, Madison, and UAU. And he also has been giving lectures at the Objective seminars annually, that's called OCON, from the Ayn Rand Institute. So now we have the great honor of having him with us, and please give him an applause.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you, Warren and Giancarlo and Luis and everyone who was involved in bringing me down to speak at UFM. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's a joy to speak here at UFM, primarily because it's a rare event for me to address an audience that already loves liberty, that is already advocating liberty and sees the value in freedom. Believe it or not, coming from the United States, the land of liberty, I'm not that accustomed to this. Universities in the United States are frequently hostile to liberty. The faculty is, in many cases, the students. So it's very refreshing to be here and address an audience that is so sympathetic to the ideas. But while I think it is safe to assume that we all are on board about the importance of liberty, I think it's also safe to assume that we all acknowledge the difficulty of getting others on board with this idea. Sure, most people say that they are for liberty. You rarely hear somebody come out and say they're against it. But are they really for liberty? Are they really for full freedom to live your life as you see fit? For everyone to do that. For everyone to be fully free to act on his own judgment for his own purposes, with respect to his own finances, with respect to health care, with respect to the schooling of his own children, with respect to his entire retirement, and so on. Not many people really want that. Not many people really want genuine liberty. Why? Why not? One reason is that genuine liberty gives rise to huge differences, huge discrepancies in wealth. If people are fully free to act on their own judgment and to keep and use the product of their effort as they see fit, some people will make much more money than other people. Some people work harder than others. Some people are more intelligent than others. Some people come up with better ideas than others. And in the natural course of events under liberty, there are huge differences in how much money people make, and thus in their lifestyles and their general wealth. People who oppose this idea, people who want equality of outcome, they want equality of goods and services, not equality before the law, but equality of goods, oppose this. Egalitarians, for instance, oppose this idea. And so they reject liberty on that ground alone. A related reason why people reject liberty is that they haven't heard the moral or philosophic arguments for liberty. Advocates of liberty often resort to purely economic arguments, setting moral and philosophic arguments aside. If markets are free, they say, then capital flows to the most efficient and effective creators of wealth, who then create new products and new businesses and jobs, and everyone becomes wealthier and happier because of it. Now, this undoubtedly is true, but no matter how well one shows that freedom leads to more general prosperity, if the listeners think that some people being wealthier than other people is morally wrong, they are not going to embrace liberty. Another reason people reject liberty is that the arguments they have heard are too complex to retain. You can see that liberty is good, they argue, if only you will read and digest these 14 books. These 4 by Ludwig von Mises, these 3 by Friedrich Bastiat, this one by James Q. Wilson, this big one by George Reisman, these 2 by Henry Hazlitt, this one by Thomas Sowell, and these few by George Gilder, and so on. Well, if the arguments for liberty are so complex and so involved that people have to read scores of books to understand them or change their career, to take this time to understand these ideas, then liberty is doomed. And then there is the opposite problem: oversimplified arguments for liberty. We're all familiar with the argument that we just need to embrace the non-aggression axiom, which, being an axiom, is obviously true and needs no further justification. We just all need to accept the idea that force needs to be banned from human relationships. Well, I don't know one person who has been persuaded by that idea, and I doubt that you do. For the purpose of understanding and conveying the requirements of liberty, neither non-philosophic nor overly complex nor oversimplified arguments will do. What we need to grasp and employ is a philosophic and properly essentialized case for liberty. Toward that end, if this atheist may employ some typically religious terminology, I think it is helpful to think of the key points as a trinity. 3 things that are simultaneously part or manifestations of a single overarching thing. The 3 things I have in mind are the principles of individualism, individual rights, and independent thinking. And the one thing of which each of these is a part or a manifestation, well, you will have to wait till toward the end of the lecture for that. Let's examine the aspects of the Trinity in turn. So individualism, individual rights, and independent thinking. Individualism is the idea that the individual's life belongs to him and that he has an inalienable right to live it as he sees fit, to act on his own judgment, to keep and use the product of his effort, and to pursue the values of his choosing. It's the idea that the individual is sovereign, an end in himself, and the fundamental unit of moral and thus political concern. This is the ideal that the American founders set forth and sought to establish when they created the land of liberty, when they wrote the Declaration and the Constitution and created a country in which individual rights were to be respected and protected. Individualism stands in contrast to collectivism, and this contrast is key. When we are trying to understand or convey ideas. Understanding not only the positive, what the idea itself is, but also the thing that is similar but that needs to be differentiated from it is very important. And in this case, what we need to contrast individualism with is collectivism. They are both ideologies, which is what makes them similar, but they are opposite ideologies. Whereas individualism holds the individual as the fundamental unit of moral and political concern, collectivism is the idea that the individual's life belongs not to him, but to the group or society of which he is merely a part. That he has no rights, and that he must sacrifice his values and goals for the group's greater good. According to collectivism, the group or society is the basic unit of moral concern, and the individual is of value only insofar as he serves the group. As one advocate of this idea put it, quote, "Man has no rights except those which society permits him to enjoy. From the day of his birth until the day of his death, society allows him to enjoy certain so-called rights and deprives him of others. Not because society desires especially to favor or oppress the individual, but because society's own preservation, welfare, and happiness are the prime considerations. And so, that society may not perish, so that it may reach a still higher plane, so that men and women may become better citizens, society permits them certain privileges and restricts them in the use of others. Sometimes, in the exercise of this power, the individual is put to a great deal of inconvenience. Even, at times, he suffers what appears to be injustice. This is to be regretted, but it is inevitable. The aim of civilized society is to do the greatest good to the greatest number. And because the largest number may derive benefit from the largest good, the individual must subordinate his own desires or inclinations for the benefit of all." Close quote. Now that paean to collectivism was written in 1913. In the years and decades that followed, as we all know, Stalin, Mao, Hitler, Mussolini, Pol Pot, and company tortured and or murdered hundreds of millions of people explicitly in the name of the greatest good for the greatest number. Historic history is clear on this. Collectivism is the ideology of socialism, communism, fascism, mass suffering, and mass slaughter. When we point this out to educated and conscientious people today, they can see that there is a problem with collectivism. And this is a good start. It is also important to point out that individualism does not hold that people must be hermits or live in the woods on their own, or that they can't benefit from working together. Of course people can and do benefit from working together in businesses, corporations, clubs, schools, and in countless other ways. But when they do, they are still individuals. Only individuals can think and exert effort. Only individuals can be productive. Only individuals can have brains or minds. Only individuals do have brains or minds. There's no such thing as a collective brain or a collective mind. You can cut an individual open, hopefully after he's dead, but you can cut him open and you can see that there is a brain in there. There is no brain in the collective or of the collective. A group is only a group of individuals. And this is a perceptual level fact. Insofar as individuals do anything together, those involved remain individuals. And individualism, holds that they should be recognized and treated as such. And this is pretty straightforward as far as it goes. But it doesn't go very far unless we unpack this idea of individualism a bit further. exactly is the individual rights aspect of individualism? This is the second element of the Trinity. In thinking about rights, there are three questions that we must ask and answer in order to understand the subject. What are rights? Where do they come from, and how do we know it? What are rights? Where do they come from, and how do we know it? Now, these are rich questions, and my goal here tonight is not to answer them in any comprehensive way, but rather just to indicate the need of a proper approach to answering these questions, and thus to understanding rights. Rights are moral principles identifying a person's proper freedom of action in a social context. They specify what actions a person should be free to take. The right to life, for instance, is the right to take the actions necessary to sustain and further one's life. The right to liberty is the right to act on the judgment of one's mind, uncoerced by others or the state. The right to property is the right to keep, use, and dispose. Notice these are all verbs. Keep, use, and dispose of the product of one's effort. The right to the pursuit of happiness is the right to pursue, a verb. The right to pursue one's chosen values, and so on. And this concept of rights is not new to anyone in this audience. This is a fairly widely accepted understanding of rights. Rights are not moral prerogatives to goods or services. They are moral prerogatives to act on your judgment for your purposes. The less understood question the two less understood questions are, where do these principles come from, and how do we know that we have rights? Where do they come from, and how do we know that we have them? If we're going to defend rights, we need to answer these questions as well. It's not enough just to say what rights are and to be able to define them. You have to be able to explain where they come from and how you know that people have them. We need to answer these questions in our own minds and also be able to answer them in conversation with others. We need to be able to convey why our thought processes on this are true and why our answers, therefore, are correct. Do rights come from God, as many advocates of liberty today say? If so, how do we know that? Do we take it on faith? Do we take it on authority? Do we accept it because our parents or our teachers or our preachers told us that rights come from God? If we tell others to take something on faith or authority, they are justified in telling us that we are out of our minds. Right? If somebody says to you something controversial about the way that human beings ought to interact, and you say to them, well, why is that? And they say, well, you just have to take this on faith or authority. My father told me this, or I just feel that it's true. You would say to him, that's not an answer. And we have to recognize that those are not answers. Those are not rational answers. Either rights are demonstrably derived from observation and logic, or they do not exist. If we can't demonstrate that rights are objective truths, how can we answer those who say, as did Jeremy Bentham, that rights are nonsense and imprescriptible rights, inalienable rights, are nonsense on stilts? Why did he say that? Because nobody was presenting evidence for the existence of rights. They were just saying, oh, they come from God or they come from nature. How can we answer, for instance, Alasdair MacIntyre, who says that the idea of rights is one with witches and unicorns? Why does he say that? He elaborates. He says, because there is equal evidence for all three. Okay? If we are going to defend rights, we have to know the answers to where they come from and how we know that we have them. Now, I've written an article on Ayn Rand's theory of rights, showing step by step how rights are derived from perceptual reality, from facts you can see. And I recommend your reading that. You can find it either at the website of the Objective Standard or simply by Googling or searching Ayn Rand's theory of rights. It'll pop right up. My purpose here is not to recount that argument, which would take an hour in itself, in its briefest form. My purpose here is rather simply to point out that advocates of liberty must have arguments. We must have arguments for what rights are, where they come from, and how we know it. We have to have real arguments. We must understand the source and nature of rights, and we must be able to field questions about them for others. It's not enough to just say, as many people do, that rights come from nature. What does that mean, that rights come from nature? Are they out there in nature and we go pick them off of trees? Are they inside us somewhere, like our heart or bones or lungs? I mean, if you cut somebody open, you're not going to find rights in there, right? There's not. So what does it mean that rights come from nature? We advocates of liberty need answers to these questions. If we don't know the objective, rational case for rights, then we actually do not know that we have rights. And we certainly cannot convince rational people that we have them. Rational people want reasons, not appeals to authority or faith or consensus or floating abstractions such as nature, undefined. This brings us to the third element of the Trinity: independent thinking. Independent thinking is a policy of always looking at the facts of a matter and forming one's own judgments about them. Well, as against what? As I said earlier, contrast is crucial. So, as against what? Well, as against the only possible alternative, expecting other people to do our thinking for us. Then no one here would ever say that if you were raised in a socialist family, that you should blindly accept those ideas. Nor would any of us say that if you were raised in a liberty-loving or a capitalist family, that you should just automatically and unthinkingly accept those ideas. Why? Why would we not say that? Because we all recognize the crucial importance of independent thinking about political matters. We all recognize that. We need to apply this same principle, however, to all areas of the intellect. To all areas of the intellect, including when we think about moral matters. One of the main arguments against rights is that they enable selfishness. And this is true. That they are in conflict with the idea that you should sacrifice. Why? Well, because if you have a right to act on your judgment, fully, to act on your judgment and pursue your goals and keep the product of your effort and so forth, that is a moral prerogative to be fully selfish. It's not necessarily the case that you would be fully selfish, but it grants you that prerogative. It, in effect, licenses pure, unadulterated selfishness. This is why people who have fought against the concept of rights have said precisely that. As Auguste Comte, the man who coined the term altruism, the term that captures the moral code that says that being moral consists in self-sacrificially serving others. Auguste Comte said because the idea of rights licenses selfishness, he said that the idea, the notion, must be completely put away. The idea of rights must be completely put away. Most, if not all of us, were raised on the idea that pursuing one's own self-interest is immoral or amoral at best, and that being moral consists in selflessly serving others. I would venture to say probably all of you were raised with that idea. But is this idea true? Do you know that it's true? Do you know the arguments for it, and that they are valid arguments? I'll bet not one person in here would answer yes to that. Is it true because there's a consensus? It's not a reason. That's a logical fallacy, right? Is it true because authorities, whether our parents or preachers or teachers, told us it's true? Those are not reasons. Why do we accept this idea if we do? Where are the arguments for you must sacrifice? Again, my purpose tonight is not to pursue the answers to each of these questions. That would take too long. My purpose is simply to point out that if we want to defend liberty, then we need to ask and answer such questions ourselves. We need to think about these things and not take the idea that rights come from nature as an absolute that needs no further consideration, or the idea that self-sacrifice is moral as some truth that needs no further consideration or needs no evidence in support of it. If it is true that self-sacrifice is moral, then morality is in conflict with the principle of rights. That's just a point of fact. In which case, if the principle of rights enables unadulterated selfishness. So if it's true that morality consists, being moral consists in sacrificially serving others, then we morally need to scrap the principle of rights. It is genuinely in conflict with morality. Now, if it's not true that self-sacrifice is moral, then we morally need to repudiate that idea and thus clear the way for a morality that is compatible with rights, a morality of non-sacrifice, a morality of rational egoism, which is the morality that Ayn Rand created and elaborated. If we care about liberty, we must demand reasons and proof in support of the moral ideas that we accept that in any way affect liberty. That in any way affect liberty. We must understand the ideas that we accept. Think about what the word understand means. To understand something means to know what stands under it. What ideas stand under it and connect it to reality. What stands under it and supports it. That's what it means to understand an idea. What anchors these ideas to observational reality in our mind? If nothing does, if there is nothing anchoring or standing under the ideas that we accept and anchoring them in reality, then the ideas are not valid. They're not true. And if we can't see what does support the idea, say the idea of rights, the principle of rights, then even if the idea is true, we still have no business in just accepting it as true if we don't understand the case for it. That would be accepting it on authority, which is wrong. As John Locke so eloquently put it, quote, "We may as rationally hope to see with other men's eyes as to know by other men's understandings. So much as we ourselves consider and comprehend of truth and reason, so much we possess real and true knowledge. The floating of other men's opinions in our brains makes us not one jot the more knowing, though they happen to be true." That's a beautiful quote. The floating of other men's opinions in our brains makes us not one jot the more knowing, though they happen to be true. Just as we do not accept political ideas merely because others say they are correct, so we should not accept moral or philosophic ideas just because others say they are true. Independent thinking in regard to these deeper philosophic matters is equally, if not more important than it is with respect to political matters. Why? Because The deeper matters are what give rise to and support the ideas in the more derivative matters, such as politics. Independent thinking, or the virtue of independence, is the policy of always looking at reality for oneself, always demanding evidence and reasons for the ideas one accepts, always demanding that the ideas that one accepts make sense, that they make sense. Think about what make sense means. Make sense means literally, make it to the sensory level. That's what makes sense means. Make it to the sensory level. Are the ideas that we accept grounded in our own perceptions of reality? Or are some of them borrowed from others, not really understood by us? In Locke's memorable phrase, the floating of other men's opinions in our brains. It is as wrong to accept moral ideas on faith or authority as it is to accept political ideas on faith or authority. And it is more damaging to our thinking because morality is more fundamental than politics. Morality defines the good. Politics takes the idea of the good as defined by morality and then applies it to the questions of how people should live together in a society. If it is in fact good to sacrifice for others, then a good society will see to it that you sacrifice. The history of the 20th century is full of examples of that. You can turn to Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia, Pol Pot's Cambodia, and the like. But if sacrifice is bad, if it's wrong to give up the values on which your life and happiness depend, then a good society will not force you to do it. A good society will clear the way for you to act as you see fit. Which one is true? What is the standard of moral value? What is the standard against which we know what is right, what is wrong? What actions are good, which are bad? What we should and shouldn't do? And how do we know what that standard is? We know that most people today accept the idea that morality consists in sacrifice. That, I think, is pretty clear. Well, where does this come from? Does it come from God's will, as Christians and Muslims say? Does morality come from divine dictates? Does it come from society's will, as socialists and subjectivists will argue? The idea that morality is just social consensus. That rights are just whatever the government gives you permission to do. Does morality come from, is it in fact the greatest good for the greatest number? And does it come from wherever utilitarians claim that it comes from? Again, social consensus or the like. Which collectivists and utilitarians hold. The requirements of man's life on earth. What about that standard of morality? Is that the standard, as objectivists say, the requirements of human life on earth? And if that is the standard of morality, what is the argument for that? What evidence supports that idea? Whatever the claim is toward a standard of value, a standard for morality, it needs to be backed up by an argument. It needs to be backed up by reasons, by observations, by logic. So what are the arguments for these views? Do they make sense to you? Do they make sense to you? And what do you think when you read these arguments? Only you, the individual, can think about this. Only you can do your thinking. And if you want to defend liberty, you must think about it. Independent thinking is an essential of freedom. To paraphrase Thomas Jefferson, if a nation expects to be unthinking and free, It expects what never was and never will be. Now, can we condense these three things, individualism, individual rights, and independent thinking, into one thing? Can we identify the one thing of which each of these is either a part or a manifestation? We can. And the clue is right there in the first letter of each. The I. The I. The me. The you. The individual. Individualism, individual rights, and independent thinking are parts or manifestations of the morality of the self, of the ego. The one to which all three of these belong is the morality of egoism. Egoism holds that each individual should pursue his own life-serving values and happiness, and that he is the proper beneficiary of his own actions. It holds that each individual deserves the fruits of his thought and his effort. You make it, you own it. And it holds that each individual is responsible for his own life and his own needs. You want it, you work for it. Egoism is the morality of self-interest and self-responsibility, which are simply two sides of the same coin. Your success is yours, and your failure is yours. If you succeed in an endeavor, whether you build a business, and if you build a business, incidentally, you did build it. If you succeed in an endeavor, then you enjoy the fruits of your labor. You properly enjoy the fruits of your labor. If you fail at something, then you should try it again another way, or try something else. Failure is not the end of the world. Ask any great successful person about failure, and he'll tell you how many times he has failed before he got to success. Failure is not a horrific thing. It's a factual part of living and exerting effort and trying. There's nothing wrong with failing. There's something wrong in failing at the same thing over and over again without correcting or thinking about it, but that's a different story. So egoism is the morality of self-interest and self-responsibility. But again, I'm not here to convince you of the correctness of egoism. I just wanted to give you sort of a definition of egoism. The correctness of egoism is a much longer discussion, and it's not the point tonight. That would be another evening. Rather, I'm here to indicate to you why I think that we advocates of liberty need to broaden and deepen the scope of what we regard as our sphere of concern, as our realm of concern. I think we all substantially agree on the validity of individualism, and on the need of individual rights, and on the virtue of independent thinking. I would venture to say everyone in here is on the same page with that. My aim tonight is simply to indicate why I think that each of these crucial elements is merely a part or a manifestation of a broader issue, of a broader value. Egoism, the morality of self-interest. Egoism holds, in regard to these three elements, the following. It holds that each individual must think for himself. This is the principle of independent thinking, and it is the central virtue of this moral code. Your mind is your basic means of living, and it's your only means of knowledge. And therefore, if you want to live a great life, if you want to make the best life you can make of your life, and if you want to achieve freedom and maintain freedom in your society, then you need to think for yourself. 2, egoism holds that each individual must be free to think for himself and to act on his judgment. There's no point in having the first prescription, to think for yourself and pursue your values, if you're not going to be free to do it. We need freedom so that we can enact the principle of individual of independent thinking, and so that we can enact egoism, so that we can live our lives according to our judgment. So this, the principle of individual rights, is basically the principle of egoism risen to the social level to answer the question of how should people interact with each other. The principle of egoism says you should act on your judgment, pursue your values, and that you are properly the beneficiary of your actions. And the principle of individual rights says because that's true, you need to be free to act on your judgment. It's essentially the same principle at two different levels in the hierarchy. And the third part of the Trinity, individualism, is simply egoism risen yet to a higher level. Egoism holds that society morally must recognize the individual as sovereign, as an end in himself, and that it morally must recognize that he has individual rights, and it must protect those rights so that he can live. This is the ideology of individualism, which is simply the principle of egoism applied fully to political thinking. All three of these are elements of the morality of egoism. The three come from that one. That is my message tonight. I hope I have indicated at least the importance of investigating these relationships. I don't pretend to have proven anything to you tonight. That was not my goal in a brief talk. But I hope I've indicated the importance of looking into these ideas, into these relationships. And I hope you will look further into this subject on your own. Thank you.